the stock market crashed as a result of Trump's tariffs, many US politicians bought the dip. And they didn't just get lucky. Their timing was so spot on that they made serious gains when the market bounced back. The thing is, their trades were so well timed that it's raised a few eyebrows. Logically, the only way they could pull this off is if they had access to information that us plebs didn't. In other words,
insider trading.
That's why today we're diving deep into the murky waters of insider trading on Capitol Hill. So, let's hold our noses and take the plunge. Recently, Democrat politicians have been going all in on accusations that President Trump's recent tariff announcements were an attempt to manipulate the market. And they're not alone. Many believe that these moves were designed to allow his associates to make a pretty penny through insider trading. Now, for anyone unfamiliar, insider trading refers to when someone trades stocks or other securities using privileged information not available to the general public. You can think of it like this. Imagine you're in a closed-door meeting at the company you work for and leadership announces a major expansion plan. At that point, you're party to information that could significantly affect the company's stock price, information regular investors don't have access to. Now, using that intel to buy or sell shares gives you an unfair edge, allowing you to cash in before the news goes public. And this kind of shady activity happens all the time, and yes, US politics is no exception. But why are people accusing Trump of market manipulation? Well, to understand this, we need to understand what caused markets to move in the first place. As you'll know, Trump became president back in January, and since then he's introduced an aggressive and sweeping trade agenda centered around the idea of enriching Americans through protectionism. He initially proposed 25% tariffs on imports from Canada and Mexico, later formalized by executive orders, alongside a 10% duty on Chinese goods. Trump justified these moves by declaring a national emergency on immigration and drug trafficking. Naturally, the affected nations weren't impressed and began dishing out retaliatory threats. China in particular responded with tariffs on US coal, energy, and agricultural machinery, along with an antitrust probe into Google. Tensions then intensified as Trump raised tariffs on steel and aluminium, or aluminum if you prefer to say it wrong. He also ended previous exemptions and introduced reciprocal tariffs to match foreign import duties. This controversial move stoked fears of global market disruption. Then, throughout March and April, Trump continued to expand his tariff regime, hitting sectors like copper, timber, autos, and oil, and at one point deliberately targeting nations that engage with Venezuela. His reciprocal tariff system imposed varying rates based on trade imbalances, with China, the EU, Japan, and South Korea receiving particularly steep levies. The US also doubled existing tariffs on Chinese imports and imposed new taxes on auto imports. At this point, enough was enough, and retaliatory tariffs were triggered by Canada, China, and the EU. By April, tensions had reached a fever pitch. Trump raised tariffs on Chinese goods to 125%, which was later revised to 145% when fentanyl-related duties were included. China countered with an 84% levy, while Canada and the EU announced billions in retaliatory tariffs too. Now, throughout all of this, investors were taking hits left, right, and center. In fact, the S&P 500 nosedived almost 20%, with roughly $10 trillion wiped off the stock market. For perspective, some analysts have compared the recent crash to Black Thursday, when Wall Street collapsed way back in 1929, almost a century ago. And yet, despite all of this, some politicians have been making some serious bank, while everyone else has been getting well and truly wrecked. What's suspicious is that a handful of investors, including some politicians, were able to buy the dip to near perfection, just as Trump announced a pause on his tariffs. The stock market subsequently breathed an almighty sigh of relief, causing markets to rally and netting these investors some hefty profits. As such, it's not hard to see why many are skeptical about the true intentions of these recent moves. Oh, and by the way, if you're enjoying the video so far, punch those like and subscribe buttons to show them who's boss, and slap that notification bell too, so you don't miss our next one. Now, obviously, insider trading isn't anything new. Heck, the New York Times found that between 2019 and 2021, 97 members of Congress reported trades in companies influenced by their committees. Now, logically, being on a committee means having access to information that's unavailable to others. Some politicians have even capitalized on privileged information to make profit during the worst economic storms, such as the financial meltdown in 2008 and during the pandemic. In the case of the 2008 crash, a selection of key congressional leaders was summoned to a closed-door emergency meeting in Washington by then Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke and then Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson. Attendees were then warned about the imminent collapse of the global financial system if they didn't bail out banks fast. As Bernanke put it, quote, "If we don't do this tomorrow, we won't have an economy on Monday." As soon as that meeting was over, many of those present wasted no time in capitalizing on this intel. Notable examples include Dick Durbin, who sold more than $110,000 in stocks right after the meeting. He also bought a boatload of Berkshire Hathaway stock right before it invested in Goldman Sachs, which the government later supported financially. Sheldon Whitehouse was another example, selling anywhere between $250,000 and $600,000 in stock before the market collapsed. Or Spencer Backus, who sold between $100,000 and $250,000 in Citigroup stock the day before it crashed. Meanwhile, Jim Moran left the meeting and immediately made trades in 90 different companies, more than on any other day that year. Goodness, what a coincidence. The pandemic was a similar story. In 2020, several senators attended a closed Senate meeting where they learned about the magnitude of the pandemic and how it would likely impact the US. Rather than spreading the word, they instead contacted their brokers. Many dumped a ton of stocks, while others bought stocks in pharmaceutical companies. For example, Richard Burr sold anywhere between $628,000 and $1.7 million in stocks, and his brother-in-law soon followed. Meanwhile, David Perdue famously made 112 transactions after the meeting, where he dumped roughly $825,000 in stocks and bought around $1.5 million of stocks in companies that would actually benefit from the pandemic, such as PPE manufacturers. Another was Dianne Feinstein, whose husband just happened to sell millions of dollars worth of shares right before the market crashed. I'll bet not one of you at home has had bedtime discussions that were anything like as lucrative. And there's Kelly Loeffler, who, alongside her husband, Jeffrey Sprecher, sold between $1.2 million and $3.1 million worth of stocks. They also bought stocks in Citrix Systems, a cloud computing company which pumped after a correction. Oh, and Jeffrey just so happens to be the founder, chairman, and CEO of the New York Stock Exchange. Another happy coincidence, eh? Now, as you'll have no doubt noticed, the values of the trades we've just mentioned are incredibly vague. This is for one very specific reason, which we'll come back to later.
It's the place to be when you're in need of amazing crypto deals and opportunities. It's got savings that you won't believe, like money off those pesky trading fees. It's the Coin Bureau Deals page. Sign up bonuses and discounts too. Coin Bureau Deals page. We put these deals together just for you, just for you.
For now, though, there's one other politician that deserves a shout-out. In fact, she deserves her very own section. Arguably, the most notorious politician in Congress to face insider trading accusations is Nancy Pelosi, who was once the 52nd Speaker of the House of Representatives. Now, Nancy reportedly has a net worth of around $274 million, despite a modest salary of just $174,000. However, she also reportedly makes around $1 million per month through other financial means. Nancy has a habit of performing incredibly well against the stock market. Too well, in fact. If insider trading allegations are true, then Nancy is an example of how corrupt politicians can become. Nancy made a boatload of cash from Nvidia call options that she and her husband Paul purchased on the 22nd of November 2023 in a leveraged bet that Nvidia's share price would go up. Oh, and incidentally, Paul also runs a VC firm that he founded. Anyway, it's worth mentioning that in the month prior to their purchase, Nvidia's price had already soared by 22%. To many, this was an awful entry point. However, the trade was placed shortly after Nancy visited Taiwan and met with the chairman of another semiconductor company. Sure enough, Nvidia calls went up by 85%, netting the Pelosis a cheeky $1.8 million in just 93 days, more than 8 times Nancy's annual salary. What's crazy is that the trade was placed while Congress was still in session, 20 minutes before the close of the market. And notably, Nancy was already trading millions in Nvidia stock in the summer of 2022, before voting on a semiconductor bill put forward by the Biden administration. 1 month later, she then helped table a bill that introduced a congressional trading ban. However, this bill was flawed and full of loopholes, likely by design. Nancy then stepped away from trading permanently. Well, that is until her leverage bet on Nvidia in late 2023. Clearly, that was too big an opportunity to miss. And this isn't the only time she's made suspiciously well-timed trades. In July 2024, her husband sold 2,000 shares of Visa, worth over $500,000, just weeks before the Department of Justice filed a lawsuit against the company. As for this year, meanwhile, Nancy's investment in Tempus AI yielded a hefty 330% return, significantly outperforming a decimated stock market. Obviously, this has drawn further attention to her trading activities. Oh, Nancy, will you ever learn? Now, this brings us to the more recent allegations of insider trading. That's because while Trump was busy dishing out import tariffs to countries like a toddler spreading germs at a daycare center, other members of Congress were busy shuffling their portfolios. At the time of shooting, just 3 names stand out. But we wouldn't be at all surprised if more come out of the woodwork in due course. In any case, the first politician facing insider trading accusations is Representative Rob Bresnahan. Fun fact, Rob once wrote in an article that, quote, "Too often we hear about how politicians are making millions of dollars during their time in office, and it is sickening. If we want to restore trust in government and our political leaders, then Congress needs to lead with these policies." Rob also told voters that once elected, he'd co-sponsor legislation that would ban congressional stock trading. Well, it turns out that he was just saying whatever it took to get in office. Since being sworn in, he hasn't suggested or supported any legislation of the sort. In fact, it's much worse. It turns out that Rob is one of the most active stock traders to join Congress. Specifically, Rob has made a whopping 283 trades since January, according to tracking website Capital Trades. As the New York Times reports, he's purchased up to $1.7 million worth of stock and has sold around $3 million in stock. Among Rob's many, many trades is his sale of up to $50,000 of stock in Alibaba, which has ties to the Chinese Communist Party. But hey, it's probably just a coincidence that this trade was made on the very same day that Trump announced he'd be doubling Chinese import tariffs. Well, maybe Rob just got lucky. Really lucky, in fact, because a spokesperson for Rob said that he relies on a financial advisor to trade stocks on his behalf and never knows about the trades. Another politician, meanwhile, who's been shoved into the limelight is Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, who chairs the House Subcommittee on Delivering on Government Efficiency, or DOGE, not to be confused with Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency, which is also called DOGE. A rabbit hole for another video, perhaps. Anywho, Marjorie, or MTG as she's often called, made stock purchases of anywhere between $21,000 and $315,000 on the 8th and 9th of April, and also dumped between $50,000 and $100,000 in Treasury bills. And as luck would have it, MTG's trades happened to be made on the day before and the day of Trump's sweeping tariff announcement. Crazy, right? Oh, and when MTG's trades were examined in the past, her response was that she also relies on a financial advisor to trade on her behalf and doesn't have any input. Where have I heard that one before? Now, at the heart of insider trading allegations is none other than President Trump himself. That's because on the 9th of April, Trump took to Truth Social to write that, quote, "This is a good time to buy." He wrote it in all caps too, so he obviously meant it. And roughly 4 hours later, Trump said he was pausing most tariffs on every country except China, resulting in massive one-day stock market gains. And as if that wasn't already suspicious enough, Trump ended the post with his initials, DJT, something he doesn't usually do. However, this also happens to be the ticker for Trump Media and Technology Group, which pumped around 23% that day. But it gets worse. Just 1 hour after Trump announced the pause on tariffs, he was then caught on camera bragging about enriching a few of his billionaire buddies, namely Charles Schwab and Roger Penske. Naturally, Democrats wasted no time in slamming Trump for these decisions. And let's be honest, it's not like they don't have a case. As such, a handful of Democratic lawmakers have called on the SEC to investigate the possibility of market manipulation and insider trading activity. Senator Elizabeth Warren responded to the clip saying this was, quote, "Donald Trump in a nutshell, doing everything he can to make the ultra-rich even richer." But it's worth remembering that it wasn't all that different under the Democrats just a few months ago. Now, as with many instances of insider trading that have happened in the past, these recent trades have caused many investors to look at ways to copy the trading activity of congressional members. And as it happens, there are a few websites that you can use to track the trading activity of politicians. One of these is the Capital Trades website we mentioned earlier. Others include the House Stock Watcher website, which tracks the trading activity of members of the House, obviously, and its sister website, Senate Stock Watcher, which, yep, you guessed it, tracks the trading activity of members of the Senate. There's also a handful of websites that track alleged insider trading activity across all kinds of sectors, not just politics. The most notable tracker here has to be Unusual Whales, which has a dedicated section tracking insider trades. Unusual Whales also has a site that tracks the trading activity of politicians, although this doesn't necessarily mean that all trades listed here are insider trading activity. However, if you see a name pop up on both lists, there's a good chance you're looking at something suspicious. In any case, we can use this site to track some of the politicians we've mentioned. So, as an example, let's zoom in on good old Marjorie Taylor Greene, who you'll recall is under the spotlight for her questionable trades. Here we can see that MTG has recently invested in a bunch of different companies, some of which include Tesla, Palantir Technologies, Nike, JP Morgan, Amazon, Nvidia, and Apple, to name just a handful. Anyhow, we'll leave links to these sites and a handful of others down in the description below so you can keep up with the latest activity. Now, while congressional members are legally allowed to participate in the stock market, trading with privileged information is illegal. The problem is that enforcing these laws is incredibly difficult. That's simply because there's usually a lack of a paper trail. And what this means is that accusations normally involve a whole lot of conjecture and not a lot of evidence. Not only that, but politicians can basically ignore these laws with very little consequence. For context, back in 2012, President Obama signed into law the Stop Trading on Congressional Knowledge, or STOC Act. Respect to whoever came up with that acronym. The law prohibits the use of non-public information for private profit, including insider trading by members of Congress and other government employees. However, it doesn't ban politicians from trading altogether. In fact, the law merely requires them to disclose trades exceeding $1,000 within 45 days of the transaction, long after other investors can react. They also only have to note broad ranges rather than specific dollar amounts, which is why the trade values we've mentioned today have been so vague. Frustrating, isn't it? And what's more is that politicians will typically either wait until the deadline date or simply miss the deadline entirely. But what happens when politicians don't abide by these rules, I hear you ask? Well, they face penalties of $200. Yeah, you did indeed hear that correctly. It's hardly a deterrent, is it? $200 is what some of these shysters will spend on lunch. And to make things worse, there's not a single publicly known case of any politician ever paying this fine. Naturally then, this begs the question of whether insider trading will ever be banned. Well, an attempt to do so was made in 2023 when Senators Kirsten Gillibrand and Josh Hawley introduced the Ban Stock Trading for Government Officials Act of 2023. I'll be honest, it's not as imaginatively titled as the Stock Act. Anywho, the Act aims to amend existing laws by imposing a flat-out ban on senior government folk and their families owning or trading stocks in order to mitigate conflicts of interest. Notably, though, the bill doesn't let anyone off the hook for using blind trusts, which are managed by independent third parties and which the beneficiary supposedly has no knowledge of or influence over. Violating this rule would result in fines of at least 10% of the value of the prohibited investments. Additionally, executive branch employees would be required to forfeit any stock profits and face fines of at least $10,000 or more, whichever is greater. Not a complete deterrent granted, but definitely a step in the right direction. Unsurprisingly, though, the bill has seen little attention from the very people it's meant to legislate. At the time of shooting, the bill's been read twice and referred to the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs. No further legislative action, such as hearings, amendments, or votes, has been recorded since its introduction, though. Since then, a handful of other bills have been proposed to address stock trading by government officials. These include the Ending Trading and Holdings in Congressional Stocks, or Ethics Act, another round of applause for that acronym. This act was introduced in April 2023, while the Ban Congressional Stock Trading Act was introduced in September 2023. There's also been the so-called Stock Act 2.0, which was introduced in December 2023 and again in January 2024, and more recently, the End Congressional Stock Trading Act was introduced in 2025. These proposals suggest an interest in addressing congressional trading concerns. However, at the time of shooting, none of these bills have made it into law. Obviously then, there's much more work that needs to be done before insider trading is stamped out for good on Capitol Hill. If we ever get there, then logically, investors won't have to compete with politicians who have an unfair advantage. And when that happens, America will be one step closer to becoming the land of opportunity. Just don't hold your breath. Now, if you want to learn more about the impact of Trump's tariffs, then you can do so by checking out this video over here. And if you want to see our top 5 stock picks for crypto exposure, then you can check out this video right over here. Thank you all for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. This is Guy, signing off.